Everything you know about the Titanic sinking is probably wrong. You've been told about the massive hole an iceberg ripped in its side like a can opener. A pretty picture. It's been shown in movies, depicted in books, repeated for 100 years. Well, there was no massive hole. When, 80 years later, scientists finally descended to the wreckage on the ocean floor and scanned the hull, they didn't find a gigantic wound. They found 6 narrow cracks, thin, like cuts. Their combined area was only about 1 square meter, the size of a door. And that's the main question of this video. How did tiny door-sized cracks sink the largest ship in the world and take 1,500 lives?
The answer isn't an iceberg. The answer is steel, rivets, and a few fateful decisions. That's what really happened.
Now look where it all began. The beginning of the 20th century. The era of the great ocean liners. A frantic race is raging across the Atlantic. Which company can transport the most wealthy passengers from Europe to America? And a British company decides to win not with speed, but with size and luxury. They build 3 giant ships. The most famous of them is the Titanic. A floating palace, the length of 4 football fields, with restaurants, a swimming pool, luxurious cabins. And it has a special pride, a security system unlike any other. It is this that will breed a deadly self-confidence. A few words about the construction itself. It's astounding. The Titanic was assembled in Belfast over several years by thousands of workers.
It was nearly 300 meters long, as tall as an 11-story building, and weighed over 50,000 tons. The hull wasn't welded, as it is today, but riveted from thousands of steel sheets.
And here's the detail that would prove fatal. The rivets in the straight middle section of the hull were set firmly by powerful hydraulic machines, with steel rivets. But the bow and stern were curved, and these machines couldn't physically reach them. So the curved bow was riveted by hand, using rivets made of softer wrought iron. It could be worked by hand. Remember that. The weakest fastening was precisely at the part of the ship that would, a few years later, scrape against an iceberg. That was the idea. The ship's bottom was divided into 16 compartments. Between them were bulkheads with watertight doors. The idea was simple and brilliant. If the hull were breached, the water would flood only one compartment. Batten down the doors, and that was it. The water wouldn't flow any further. The ship would stay afloat. The engineers calculated that the Titanic would stay afloat even if several forward compartments flooded at once. No other ship had such a safety margin.
And hence the fateful phrase. The ship was called virtually unsinkable. Virtually. Soon, no one would pay attention to that word. Everyone would remember only unsinkable.
But here, in the design itself, lies the first fatal flaw. Look closely. The bulkheads between the compartments didn't reach all the way to the top. They rose only a few meters above the waterline and then broke off. The compartments were open at the top. As long as the ship remained level, this didn't matter. But imagine the bow began to sink. The forward compartments flooded. The ship tilted forward, and the water, reaching the top of the bulkhead, simply spilled over the edge into the next compartment, then into the next, and into the next, like water spilling over the edges of an ice tray when it was tilted. The compartments, designed as a refuge, turned into a trap. But no one thought of that. After all, the ship was unsinkable. And now the numbers of the disaster itself. April 14th, 1912. Night. The North Atlantic. Water temperature outside is -2 degrees.
The Titanic is going almost full speed, about 22 knots. And this is already the second fatal mistake. The captain had been warned about icebergs in this area many times, but the ship did not slow down.
The race for a time record was more important. The enormous machine was hurtling through the ice field, almost blind, at night. On paper, it was suicide, but the ship was unsinkable. 11:45 in the evening, the lookout shouts, Iceberg dead ahead! 37 seconds of terror follow. The rudder is shifted, the engines try to stop. But a ship weighing 50,000 tons has monstrous inertia. It cannot be stopped or swerved instantly. The Titanic almost misses. Almost. It doesn't hit the iceberg head-on. It merely slides alongside it on its starboard side. Many passengers didn't even feel the impact, just a slight tremor.
They didn't know that this sliding, almost gentle contact had just sealed the ship's death warrant. Because at that moment, a catastrophe occurs underwater.
And here we come to the real cause of the sinking: steel and rivets. Let's start with steel. In 1912, the Titanic's steel was considered the best, but it had a hidden flaw. It contained too much sulfur. And steel with that composition behaves treacherously in the cold. In warm water, it bends. But in icy water, at -2 degrees, it becomes brittle as glass. It doesn't bend under impact, it splinters. This is called brittle fracture, and the metal, which should have been springy, cracked when it hit the ice. But steel is only half the problem. The main culprits are the rivets. In those days, hulls weren't welded. They were assembled from thousands of steel sheets, held together with millions of rivets. 3 million rivets held the ship together. And here's what scientists discovered decades later after retrieving the rivets from the seabed and examining them under a microscope.
The rivets in the bow weren't steel. They were wrought iron, and they contained 3 times more slag than the permissible level.
Slag is dirt, glassy impurities within the metal. Essentially, these were defective rivets, cheaper and weaker than needed. And they were installed precisely where the iceberg struck, in the bow. And here's how scientists proved it. It turns out there's direct evidence. The Titanic had a sister ship, the Olympic. In 1911, it collided with another ship, and photographs of its damaged side clearly show dozens of rivets simply knocked out of the hull, leaving empty holes. The same type of rivets as on the Titanic. It was a visual rehearsal for disaster. It's just that no one understood the warnings back then. And the main evidence was recovered from the very bottom. The wreckage of the Titanic wasn't found until 1985, almost 4 kilometers underwater. Pieces of the hull planking and those very rivets were recovered from there. And only then, under a microscope in a lab, did the real cause of the sinking become clear. The truth about the Titanic was learned more than 70 years after its death.
Now let's put it all together and see what happened in those few seconds. The iceberg slides alongside the ship. It presses against the hull with tremendous force.
The steel, brittle in the cold, cracks. And the faulty iron rivets, brittle in the cold, can't withstand the load. Their heads fly off one after another. And here's the key moment. The rivets fly out, and the steel plating sheets split at the seams. The hull doesn't rip open in a single hole. It unzips along the rivet lines, like a zipper on a jacket. This is where those 6 narrow gaps come from instead of a huge hole. Water finds these separated seams and rushes in from several places at once. And here's where all the mistakes came together. The cracks stretched along the bow and exposed more than just one compartment, not just 2. Water poured into 5 or 6 forward compartments at once, and the ship was designed to survive the flooding of only 4. Fatal arithmetic. 1 more compartment than it could withstand. The bow began to feel heavy and sink.
And then that very first mistake kicked in. The bulkheads weren't sealed at the top. The bridge had managed to pull the lever and batten down the watertight doors between the compartments as intended, but that didn't solve anything.
The doors held the water at the sides, and it simply spilled over. The water in the forward compartments rose to the edge of the bulkhead and flowed over the top into the next compartment, then into the next. The ship tilted ever more sharply, and the water spilled ever further aft. The unsinkable ship was sinking itself compartment by compartment. And here's the cruelest paradox of that night. If the Titanic hadn't tried to swerve, but had hit the iceberg head-on, it would likely have stayed afloat. A head-on impact would have crushed one or two forward compartments. The ship was designed to withstand the flooding of 4. It would have survived. The people at the very bow would have perished, but the ship would have held firm and waited for help. It was precisely the attempt to turn away, the seemingly most sensible reaction, that exposed the entire side of the ship to the ice and ripped open 6 compartments at once. It wasn't a mistake that destroyed the ship, but its instinct to save itself. Then came the math of the end. The Titanic stayed afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes.
The bow sank, the stern rose higher and higher. And at some point, the strain became monstrous. The stern hung in the air, and the weight pulled the bow down. The hull couldn't withstand this fracture, and it didn't break in a random plate.
A longship has special expansion joints, breaks in the superstructure that allow the hull to bend slightly with the waves. One such joint ran right near the 3rd funnel. The structure was weaker there, and that's where the stress concentrated. The ship broke in 2, roughly between the 3rd and 4th funnels. The 2 halves sank separately to the bottom, to a depth of almost 4 kilometers. But that's not the whole tragedy. There was a 3rd fatal mistake: the lifeboats. There were more than 2,200 people on board, and there was only room in the lifeboats for about half. Why? Because by the standards of the time, there were enough lifeboats, and also because the owners believed the ship was unsinkable. Why would there be lifeboats on a vessel that couldn't sink? They even installed fewer for aesthetic reasons, to avoid cluttering the promenade deck. And when disaster struck, there was simply no way to save everyone. More than 1,500 people remained on the sinking ship and in the icy water. And there was another bitter detail. Another ship was moored nearby. Its crew saw the Titanic's flares in the night, but didn't realize they were a desperate call for help and didn't respond.
By then, the ship's radio operator was already asleep. Listening around the clock wasn't mandatory back then. Help arrived only in the early morning from another liner rushing in from far away, but it only managed to pick up those in lifeboats. It was too late for the rest.
There's another theory favored by researchers. Even before the Titanic's departure, a smoldering fire had been raging in one of its coal bunkers. The coal burned for many days, and the heat could have weakened the metal of the bulkhead right in the bow, the very spot where the water later gushed in. This can't be proven with certainty, but many believe the red-hot wall of the compartment was already weakened by the time of impact. Another small link in the chain that led to the disaster. That's the whole point. It wasn't an iceberg that sank the Titanic. The iceberg merely pulled the trigger. The ship was destroyed by a chain of mistakes, each one seemingly insignificant in isolation. Steel too brittle in the cold, defective rivets in the most vulnerable spot, bulkheads not fully sealed, too much speed in the ice, too few lifeboats, and most importantly, blind faith in the word unsinkable. Remove any one link in this chain, and perhaps the disaster would not have happened, or far fewer people would have died. And that's precisely why the Titanic changed the world forever. After that night, the rules were rewritten. There had to be enough lifeboats for every single person. Bulkheads on ships were built to the brim. An international ice watch was established to monitor icebergs in the Atlantic. A ship's radio operator was required to listen 24/7. Each of these rules is inscribed in the name of those who perished that night. Engineering often learns the hardest way, from its own disasters. The Titanic became one of the most terrible and important lessons in its history.
Engineering often learns the hardest way from its own disasters. The Titanic became one of the most terrible and important lessons in its history.
If you're interested in such analyses, how man builds the impossible and what happens when he makes mistakes, subscribe. We only analyze stories like these here. See you at the next structure.